Have you ever forgotten someone's name while they were still saying it? Not a week later, not after a long day. I mean the exact moment they introduced themselves. "Hi, I'm Michael." And somehow, before the conversation has even started, Michael is already gone. What follows is a strange little performance. You smile, you nod. You pray someone else says their name first. Maybe an email appears. Maybe a friend walks over and saves you. Maybe some miracle happens before you're forced to admit that the one piece of information you were supposed to remember disappeared almost instantly. If you've experienced this, you're far from alone. In fact, many people who struggle most with remembering names have excellent memories in almost every other area of life. They remember conversations from years ago. They remember where they met someone. They remember the story about that person's childhood dog, their recent vacation, or the strange opinion they shared over coffee. Yet somehow the name itself never seems to stick. At first glance, this feels backwards. Surely a name should be the easiest thing to remember. It's short, simple, usually only a word or two. But psychologically speaking, names are surprisingly weak pieces of information. Think about it this way. Imagine meeting two strangers. One tells you his name is Daniel. The other tells you he's a firefighter who once rescued a family from a burning apartment building. A week later, which detail do you think your brain is more likely to remember? The answer is obvious.
The story wins.
It almost always wins, and that's because your brain isn't designed to remember everything equally. It's constantly making decisions about what deserves valuable mental space. Meaning gets priority. Emotion gets priority. Stories get priority. Names often don't. Psychologists have known this for decades. One famous finding is called the Baker-Baker paradox. Researchers showed participants a photograph of a man. One group was told the man was a baker by profession. The second group was told the man's surname was Baker. Days later, people remembered the occupation far more easily than the name. The word was identical, but the meaning was different. When you hear baker, your mind instantly creates connections. Fresh bread, flour, early mornings, ovens, warm smells. But when baker is simply someone's last name, those connections disappear. The word becomes a label rather than an idea. And labels are surprisingly fragile inside human memory, which explains something many chronic name forgetters have suspected for years. The problem isn't necessarily that they aren't paying attention. The problem may be that their brain is paying attention to something else, something it considers more important. But that raises an interesting question. If names are so difficult for the brain to hold on to, why do some people seem capable of remembering every single one they hear? And why do others forget them almost immediately? The answer has less to do with intelligence than most people realize. One reason is that different people don't store information in the same way. Some minds are naturally label-oriented, others are association-oriented, and people who frequently forget names often belong to the second group. When they meet someone, they aren't unconsciously cataloging labels. They're collecting impressions. They're remembering the guy who owns the classic Mustang, the woman who moved across the country to start over, the coworker who drinks black coffee every morning, the friend who laughs so hard they can't finish a sentence. The person stays. The label disappears. This is why so many people say something that sounds contradictory at first. I remember everything about them except their name. But psychologically, it makes perfect sense. Because the brain doesn't store people as ID cards. It stores experiences. It stores patterns. It stores emotional significance. For many people, a name simply isn't the most meaningful part of another human being. There's another factor that makes this even more difficult: social self-awareness. When most people meet someone new, they're not just listening. They're performing. They're monitoring their body language, wondering if they're making enough eye contact, thinking about what to say next, trying not to sound awkward, trying not to seem boring, trying not to accidentally embarrass themselves. And while all of that is happening, the person's name quietly passes through the conversation for a fraction of a second. The brain hears it, but it never fully processes it. Researchers have actually observed something similar in what's known as the next-in-line effect. People waiting for their turn to speak often remember less of what was said immediately before they spoke, not because they weren't listening, because part of their attention had already moved ahead. They were preparing, rehearsing, editing. And many chronic name forgetters live in that mental state almost constantly. Their attention is split between the conversation and their own internal commentary. If you've ever walked away from an introduction and realized you forgot the person's name almost instantly, this might be why. Not because your memory failed, because your attention was busy elsewhere. But anxiety and self-awareness aren't the only reasons people forget names. In fact, some people struggle with names even when they're completely comfortable socially. Teachers, managers, bartenders, retail workers, anyone who meets dozens or even hundreds of people every week, for them the issue is often much simpler. Their brain is overloaded, and when that happens, memory becomes selective. It starts filtering information based on what seems most useful in the moment, which means sometimes forgetting a name isn't a flaw at all. It's simply the brain trying to manage more information than it was ever designed to handle. And there's one final mystery that almost every chronic name forgetter has experienced. You're driving home, taking a shower, lying in bed hours after the conversation ended, and suddenly, without warning, the name appears. Jason, Emily, Mark. The very name your brain refused to provide when you needed it most. This happens because memory retrieval and memory storage are not the same thing. Many times the information was never truly lost. It was simply inaccessible, like a book sitting somewhere in a massive library without a clear path leading to it. Then later, a random thought, emotion, image, or association accidentally leads you back to the shelf, and the name returns as if it had been there all along. Because in many cases it was. This is also why people who struggle with names often find that associations help tremendously. Connecting a name to someone you already know, repeating it during conversation, attaching it to a visual image or story. These techniques work because they give the brain what it naturally wants: meaning. Instead of asking memory to hold a loose label, you're creating connections that make retrieval easier later. But perhaps the most important thing to understand is this: forgetting names does not automatically mean you're careless. It does not mean you're unintelligent, and it certainly does not mean you don't care about people. In fact, many of the people who struggle most with names are often paying attention to things others completely miss. They remember the emotion behind a conversation, the hesitation in someone's voice, the excitement when they talked about something they loved, the subtle details that reveal who a person actually is. And maybe that's why so many name forgetters share the same strange experience. They'll forget what someone is called, but they'll remember exactly how that person made them feel. They'll remember the story about their family, the challenge they were going through, the dream they couldn't stop talking about. The conversation itself remains vivid long after the label has faded. And perhaps that's worth remembering the next time you feel embarrassed for asking someone's name again. Because while names matter, they were never the most interesting thing about a person. Not their kindness, not their struggles, not their passions, not their character. Just a sound assigned to them long before they became who they are. The truth is, your brain may not be ignoring people at all. It may simply be prioritizing something deeper, the person behind the name. And if you've ever worried that forgetting names means you aren't paying attention, consider this. Maybe you've been paying attention to the parts that matter most all along. If you've experienced this yourself, let me know in the comments. What's the longest you've known someone before finally remembering their name? And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe for more psychology and human behavior insights.